Classes in session. Hey everybody, welcome to Unlearn 16 Classes in Session. You just get me today. You just get me, but you're gonna get the teacher me. You always get the teacher me because I can't really ever shut that off. But today we're going to talk about democracy in Canada. I need this as a lead up because hopefully next week I'm going to have a pretty awesome guest come on and we're going to talk about the trucker convoy. But a lot of people are throwing around words like democracy and freedom, and they're talking about our constitutional rights. And in fact, I don't think a lot of people understand the parameters of democracy, the limitations to our freedoms and what those look like. I don't think a lot of people understand that. So today I'm going to do my best to give you my grade 12 politics lesson on what a democracy looks like specifically in Canada and what those indicators are. First and foremost, I'm going to give you a brief sort of depiction of what a parliamentary democracy looks like. I have a lot of people from the States who listen to me who don't necessarily know our democratic system, and a lot of Canadians who really haven't taken civics for a very, very long time and maybe have, lost the thread of what goes on in this country. So let me stipulate. Canada is broken up constitutionally into two different power groups, the federal government, provincial government. Their jurisdictions are separate, although connected through money. We can talk about that later. So provincially, in Canada, we elect a premier under a certain party or certain banner, and they serve a term as our premier. We have no limits on those spots. Federally, we have our prime minister and his or her cabinet. They're also elected democratically in the same way that our provincial premiers are elected, and they are elected with no limitations on how much they can run either. Today, I'm just going to talk federally. Federally, this is the way it works. Canada is broken up into 338 ridings. Each riding, geographically, represents approximately 150,000 to 200,000 Canadians. Each riding gets one MP. So we have our election, and it's spread out over the whole country. Every riding votes, and every riding gets a winner. Now, those winners don't always win by a majority. If there are 4 or 5 candidates in that riding, that vote can be very much split. You could win the most votes with only 25% of the entire vote. So that's why you get different sort of perceptions or different realities when it comes to how many seats did you win versus the popular vote. So 338 ridings. There's an election. Prior to that election, each political party has already chosen their leader. There's a party convention. If you want to choose the party's leader, you can belong to the party if you're over 18, and you can go to the convention and you can vote for that leader. You can listen to the debates and choose between their 7 options, or however many options there are. Other than that, you wait to see what a leader is announced, since you're not going to go to the convention, and then you vote. And if you vote Liberal in your riding for your particular candidate, you know in the back of your mind that if the Liberals win the most or the majority seats in the House of Commons, 338, that their leader that has already been chosen will become Prime Minister. And then the Prime Minister will choose his or her cabinet from the other people that have been elected within that party. So everything in Canada has to be elected. In the United States, it works a little bit differently. The president's chosen separately, and he or she, unfortunately it's only been a he so far, but here we go, Kamala. He or she has to choose their cabinet from outside the government altogether. So it's a complete separation of powers, where in Canada, it's a fusion of powers. All of that being said, our Prime Minister gets elected for 5-year terms. And every 5 years, they can run again. Now, if they have a majority, they can call an early election, just like Trudeau did not too long ago. If you call an early election, let's say around year 3, when you're very popular, you have the opportunity to get re-elected for another 5 years. We don't have any limits on those terms either. I think our longest running prime minister, 16 years, maybe, Mackenzie King. I could be wrong, but he did, speak to his dead mother through crystal ball. So neither here nor there. So all of these things being true, when people are talking about democracy in Canada, I don't know if they're really challenging the way we elect, because there are flaws there. And I'll come back and I'll do a whole separate podcast talking about the flaws in how we elect, if we should have more of a system where we elect our leaders separately, and all of those kind of intricacies. Having said that, what I want to talk today is about what democracy means and how it functions in a democracy. But let me be clear. No one, anywhere, period, has a full democracy. Having a full and complete democracy would mean every citizen, over the age of 18, has the right to vote on every single issue that is ever put before government, or that is ever put to the entire country. Now, a lot of people would say, why not? Why don't we do that? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Number one, I know nothing about fishing rights in northern BC. And the idea that I would vote on that doesn't make one hell of a lot of sense. Number two, it would be the cost of that would bring us to a grinding economic halt. So it doesn't make a lot of practical sense. It doesn't make a lot of even ideological sense, because I don't know what I'm talking about when I vote on fishing rights in BC. So all of those things being equal, let's get into what builds a real democracy, because a lot of people just talk about voting rights, right? That's what we get to do. We vote, and when we vote, the majority wins, we go on our way. And a lot of the things about protesting is trying to speak to what happens during a political sort of office, a political candidate has taken office and they're in there for that 5-year term. How are we allowed to influence policy then? Because if we just elect and we have no way to influence policy, technically you've elected a dictator for 5 years. That's not quite the way it goes. So I'm going to take you through 8 very simple yet incredibly complicated aspects of what a full democracy looks like, where we do well, where we fall short. But I want you to see a full picture before we judge protests or before we judge invoking emergency powers acts or anything like that. And the first aspect of democracy that everybody talks about is majority rule. This is like the founding principle, right? Whatever the majority wants, whatever the majority says, that's what goes. And when I say a majority, it's funny because that doesn't even apply in all circumstances. I'll give you an example. Right now, Trudeau has a minority government. What that means is he doesn't have 50% of those 338 seats. So in order for Trudeau to pass something and the Liberals to pass something, other MPs, Member of Parliament, need to side with him and vote with him, or else nothing passes. I don't know how many people quite understand that. But when a majority of people in the House of Commons pass a piece of legislation, it then goes to the Senate. If the Senate passes it, Queen signs it into law. Please, I don't want to fight about the Queen right now. All my best to her in, COVID crisis. So all of this goes there. It gets signed into law. That's what a majority rule is. But, and here's the big, huge caveat. In a democracy, we have to go to number 2, which is minority rights. So, the majority is allowed to push through things that they want in their country. That's what a democracy is about. However, the majority cannot use their power of a majority in order to oppress or subvert or control the minority. So in a lot of ways, if we had a majority of Canadians saying we don't like gay marriage, it doesn't matter, because our Constitution, which is the fundamental building block of our society, stipulates those are rights you cannot trample on. So the majority and our civil rights are in constant balance. I'm going to talk about that when it comes to truckers next week a little bit in more detail. Now, after minority rights, in order to protect the minority, in order to make sure that the majority gets what they want, but always taking into account minority rights as laid out in our Constitution of Rights and Freedoms and our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we have number 3, which is rule of law. And rule of law stipulates that no one's above the law. Now, a lot of people at home, you should be sitting there laughing a little bit at that one, because we all know there are many ways that rule of law doesn't play into a lot of democracies, and specifically because the more money you have, the more power you have in the legal system, the more ways out you have. If you have an individual with no money who steals a car, an individual with a lot of money who steals the exact same car at the exact same time, they both go on the joyride, the kid with no money is going to get a public defender, and the kid with money is going to be able to buy a team of lawyers that could quite possibly, and in more practicality, make sure they don't spend any time in jail. So, in a system where I buy how good my defense is, if I can, all of a sudden this idea of rule of law becomes very hard to access for everybody. And I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. It's also who you know. There's no question about that. Now, number 4, interest groups. In a democracy, you're allowed to have many interest groups. Interest groups like PETA, like Greenpeace, like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, like the truckers convoy would be considered an interest group. And all these individuals are absolutely allowed to have their voices heard. But to what extent are they allowed to have their voice heard? To what extent are they allowed to have access to politicians? Having your voice heard and taking people hostage might be two very different things. Now, one of the most important features of democracy that a lot of people don't fixate on, the idea of voting and having a very pretty constitution, is only one element of a democracy, and it's a very easy element to pretend as though you have, and look at my pretty documentation right here. But number 5 is judicial independence, is the idea that the Supreme Court of Canada is here in order to ensure that they uphold our constitutional rights and freedoms. It is the Supreme Court's job to make sure that the government never crosses that line and takes away our democratic freedoms and our civil rights. Now, here's the sticking point. What happens when your right interferes with my right? I said, this was in a movie, I can't remember what movie it was actually, I think it was The Siege, and somebody said, it's easy to choose between right and wrong. The hard thing is to choose between which wrong is more right. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but hear me out. So right now we're sitting in a time where, and we can talk about COVID, I'm not going to particularly talk about the protests, but let's just talk about the mandates for a minute. Because a lot of people feel as though the mandates are interfering with their freedom, their liberty. And our Charter 7 rights talk about life and liberty. But here's the question. The life aspect is the mandates to keep people safe, are the mandates to keep them healthy, are the mandates to reduce the impact and the crushing sort of weight on our medical system. And liberty is our freedom to do what we want to do. During a pandemic, these things are at odds. So, our elected officials have to make a choice. Absolute freedom interferes with life. And if we only prioritize life, then our liberties are at risk. So how do we balance the two? By the way, life comes before liberty in the Constitution. It makes perfect sense. It does. That our lives should be protected first and foremost. So these mandates, and again, we can argue them separately. I'm just arguing sort of ideologically here for a second so you understand the system. Our government's job at this point, no matter who is in charge, needs to decide, how do I balance those two rights? And having mandates and certain people that they have to get the shot or they can't do this job, or you have to get the shot or you can't go into a gym or a restaurant, this is the balance that they have decided is legitimate. Now, whether or not you agree with that balance, it's a whole other discussion. But that's the question that gets posed to democratic governments all the time. How do we balance rights? Because earlier I said minority rights. So I'll give you an example. If you are Mormon, you don't believe in blood transfusions. As an 18-year-old individual, you can decide that you do not want a blood transfusion. Here's where it gets messy. I also get to decide for my 6-year-old son. So we get into a car accident, my 6-year-old son needs a blood transfusion. I, as the parent, get to decide that that's not going to happen for them, even though it's very clear it's going to save their life. And that goes to the courts. And sometimes that goes to the courts very, very quickly. But all the while, we are trying to balance individual rights, individual freedoms. And that's why people have made all sorts of comparisons between, let's say, my right to smoke and my right to smoke inside the keg. Now, quite a few years ago, that right was taken. We said that my right to smoke didn't get to usurp, it didn't get to infringe upon everybody else in that restaurant, including the workers who have to work there in order to make a paycheck. So what happens is that right gets taken away. I mean, I grew up in an age where parents smoked in the car, people smoked in the mall, people smoked in hospitals, in the rooms with patients. I grew up in a very unique age, and at some point we decided, and to the hatred of a lot of smokers, we decided that their right to smoke shouldn't infringe on somebody else's right not to have smoke in their lungs in an enclosed space. And again, COVID has just introduced that in a very different way and in a very quick way because of the risk that it posed to the people. But having an independent judiciary, having a Supreme Court that is completely separate from the government. Now, a lot of people are going to say, well, it's not completely separate because, and this is true in the United States and Canada, when it comes to the Canadian government, they appoint Supreme Court justices. So in a way, they have had their influence. And part of that is true. Whether you're conservative or liberal, the NDP have never controlled the federal government, so they've never appointed anyone. Or if you're looking at who Trump's appointed as opposed to who Biden would like to appoint, all of those have influences in the Supreme Court, absolutely true. But once they're appointed, the government cannot step in and pressure in any way, shape, or form. In fact, their jobs are completely secure in that appointment. So that's what separates them from the rest of the body or the rest of the political system. And judicial independence and the Supreme Court's ability to strike down laws made by the federal government is perhaps one of the most significant sort of pinnacle moments in democracies where you really want to see if a democracy is working when the Supreme Court tells the federal government what they can and can't do. That's the key, right? I'll give you an example. When gay marriage wasn't legal in Canada, Paul Martin, who was a Liberal Prime Minister at the time, was looking to see if he was going to pass gay marriage. Now, it wasn't popular in 2005 or whenever it was. It wasn't a popular choice. But he wanted to see, before he passed the law, he did something very politically intelligent, whether or not you agree with the rest of his politics or not. What he decided to do was to take it to the Supreme Court before passing the law. So basically, there's a particular process in which you can put this before the Supreme Court and say, is this constitutional? Is gay marriage, according to the Supreme Court and your reviewing of our Constitution, our Charter, is gay marriage a constitutional right for Canadians? Supreme Court said absolutely it is. So then Paul Martin goes back to the House of Commons and he presents it, something to pass in the House of Commons, and says, listen, whether or not you agree with gay marriage or not, whether or not your religion precludes it, whether or not your morals or your whatever you want to talk about, it doesn't matter. Because at the end of the day, our Supreme Court dictates that this is a fundamental right according to our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And he was very smart in that. Because either at that point, you either stood against the Charter or with gay marriage. He didn't make it a political issue. He made it a charter issue. And that was a very sort of intelligent way of going around it. Now, number 6, civilian control of the army. This is a hard one. This is a hard one because it never feels like civilians have an awful lot of control of the army. When I say civilian control of the army, you guys have to understand it is not public control of the army. When I say civilian control of the army, I mean that what our army does or does not do is controlled through our elected representatives. So our elected representatives can decide and will decide what wars we go into, what peacekeeping missions we sign up for, how much money is spent, where it's spent, when we come home, if things go awry, how it gets investigated. Now, a lot of those investigations might be withheld from the general public due to issues of national security, whether or not I agree that that's always an issue or not. They'll be withheld from the general public so that they can make a decision based on what went on there. I think one of the most significant ways that in my years of listening to judicial inquest into our military was when the Canadian military, specifically the airborne, went into Somalia and set up camp during a peacekeeping mission, ended up detaining, arresting, and then beating to death a 16-year-old Somali boy for trespassing onto their military base. And I think he was stealing tools, not weapons, but tools, probably in order to sell. Now, when this happened, the whole mission was scrapped. They were brought back and they were all put on trial. The airborne was disbanded. Let's be honest, the airborne gets recreated under a different name, but nonetheless, none of that was made like public. It wasn't on, our major news networks because of all of the different moving aspects going on with our military. But it does mean that there is civilian oversight. Whether we think that oversight is big enough, that's definitely a discussion for another day. Now, number 7 is hard. Number 7 is political diversity. What really makes a democracy robust is having different viewpoints that you can then choose from to elect. And I think over the years, we have seen a narrowing of these viewpoints in a lot of ways. In the United States, they have 2 political parties. They have the Democrats and the Republicans. So they only have 2 viewpoints. In Canada, we have federally, we have the Conservatives, the Liberals, the NDP, Conservatives being the most right, the NDP being the most left. We have the Green Party. We have the Bloc Québécois, who just runs in Quebec. Even if they run federally, they only run in Quebec. And we have some other minor parties as well. But that's 5 major parties that when we see major debates for our federal leadership, for our federal elections, and for Prime Minister, we see 5 major parties debating the issues. Now, I like the idea of that political diversity. Ironically, once they're in power, I've found a lot less diversity in action. Let me say that. I've found that different elements have been created, or different elements influence how people get to actually express their political ideology on a national scale if they get elected. Now, in Canada, we've only ever had 2 parties that have formed government. We've only ever seen the Conservatives and the Liberals form government. None of those other parties have ever formed the majority of government in Canada and their leader become Prime Minister. So we haven't seen how those play out. But if I look at Liberals and Conservatives, a lot of the times you find not their rhetoric might be different, but you find when they get into office that the way they play things out is remarkably similar. And I think one of the big reasons is this. We give the illusion that in a democracy, we have complete sovereignty. Sovereignty means independence over what goes on in our country. The notion of state sovereignty is really old, and I think it's really outdated. for a whole bunch of reasons. And right now we're sitting in one of them. COVID and the international crisis, the pandemic level, the international implications of COVID as a virus, as it affects the globe, and then how it impacts Canada specifically, should show us that this notion that our elected representatives can control everything that goes on within their borders to be a little ridiculous. The idea that COVID needs to be an international response makes perfect sense. But then there's this horrible idea or this very difficult, painful idea about how do we balance democracy? Because I didn't vote for who the Prime Minister of England is or the President of the United States or any of these other world leaders that are going to sit down and decide an international strategy. And if I didn't vote for them, what happens to my democracy? If Trudeau or my Prime Minister doesn't have the ultimate say, doesn't my democracy get watered down? And the answer is, of course it does. Absolutely it does. We need to acknowledge that as a reality rather than pretending it doesn't exist. It also gets watered down when it comes to our environment. We sit in Canada and we pass environmental legislation, which I think is incredibly important. But unless we have serious international agreement, things like the Paris Accords are an example, but serious international agreement about the way that every single country is going to act and react, then these environmental concerns tend to be an upward climb that we're not all on the same page. I mean, we sit right next to the United States. We share lakes. If we pass significant environmental legislation, the United States said, no, we're not, because it affects our economy. And of course it does affect everybody's economy. Then we're kind of at an impasse because we're still being controlled and we are still being impacted by the wind and the storm systems and the impacts on the environment that we don't necessarily control. It's going to be impacted. The only way you solve that is put a giant bubble over Canada. And I don't think even Elon Musk has come up with that idea yet. I do say yet because you never know what he's working on. But this idea that we are sovereign when it comes to our environment is ridiculous. So what happens to my democracy there? Well, it fades. And I'm going to go you one step further. Our economy, right? Every single politician talks about Canada's economy. Every single politician says that I can fix the economy. Not a single politician, none of them, will admit how much of our economy is woefully out of our grasp, especially a country like Canada. A country like Canada has incredible natural resources that we don't produce here. I'll give you an example. We have a lot of wood, right? So you think all those nice dining room tables we all own would be Canadian made, but they're not. For lots of reasons. One of the big reasons is we have all these natural resources, but not a lot of manufacturing because our manufacturing needs to compete with the United States because of things like free trade. So it is cheaper for me as a Canadian as a government, we sell our wood to the United States. Companies like Lexington make our tables. They send them back up here. We buy American-made tables. And I know a lot of people aren't even buying American-made because we're buying Malaysian-made because that's even cheaper. But we're buying these tables from all different places because they're less expensive. And there it is. We are constantly, in this country, out of pocket. We sell our resources, we buy back manufactured goods. And a big reason is because we are a part of this incredibly significant NAFTA agreement, or the new name, I can't remember, and I'm annoyed Trump changed it. We're a part of this whole agreement in order to get more supply and more goods accessed amongst all levels of these three different countries. What it invariably does is it ties it to other countries' economies. Lots of people love to talk about China. They'll talk about human rights abuses, and they want our government to do something in China. Yet, I have never heard a single government official truly proclaim we should stop trading with China. Why? Because it would have devastating impacts on our economy. So then what? What are we willing to trade? I'll give you a perfect example. I love, as far as conservatives go, I was always relatively impressed with Brian Mulroney. Brian Mulroney was prime minister during the Tiananmen Square massacres in China. And initially, right away, he wanted to block trade. And then in about 10 minutes, he took it all back. We're making constant decisions on what we're going to do, what is the right thing to do, and what is the economic thing to do. And I think that balance, again, isn't just Canadian. Everybody's talking about gas prices, right? Well, gas prices are controlled outside of our country on the whole. Depending on what different oil-producing countries set gas prices or oil prices at. One of the perfect examples of this would have been in the early 70s when oil-producing exporting countries, known as OPEC, decided to quadruple, times 4, oil prices. That just didn't quadruple gas, that quadrupled everything that relied on oil or gas for energy, for production, for transportation. It was a nightmare. And right in that moment, you saw that Canada, and P.S. no country, has complete and utter control over their economy. And I think we're past that point of no return now. I know that Trump loved to say, bring back American businesses to the United States. We're going to have more American manufacturing. We can't afford it. People can't afford it anymore. Why? Well, because in the United States, we demand, and in Canada, we demand a minimum wage. Well, when you demand a minimum wage, then those companies up their costs in order to make a significant profit and pay whatever it is we're saying they have to pay. So if I buy an American-made t-shirt and I have to spend $25 for a whole bunch of reasons, or I could get my t-shirt from Walmart, from textiles company in, let's say, Bangladesh for $5, people are making different choices on that, right? So when the Canadian government makes economic choices, it can't exist in a bubble. So our democracy gets, whittled down or watered down then. But I don't think we can shut that gate. I don't think we can go back. And I don't think anybody really wants to go back to the isolationist policies that we had prior. Because let me denote a good thing. When our economies are intrinsically tied, I have a goal. I have an intrinsic desire for their economy to do well as well. Otherwise, we both suffer. And that connection can sometimes make us more apt to do better things for this world than not. But having politically diverse ideologies also means different ideas when it comes to economic issues. I know in the United States, they love to shout about communists constantly. But listen, capitalism is our current economic structure. And I could do an entire podcast on the basis on whether or not capitalism is the best, or whether or not we're living in a post-capitalist society anyway. But the point of the matter is, let's all assume it's not the be-all and end-all. Let's all assume that society doesn't stop changing here, that economic theory doesn't halt here, that there could be better, that we could do better. So, if we exclude all possible other economic theories and ways to adjust or ways to completely obliterate and start over, we are actually causing ourselves damage. Now, the last one is individual civil rights. Obviously, in this world and in a democracy, you need freedoms. You need civil rights, freedoms. And those civil rights, let me be real clear about this, is a protection of your government from your government. So, my civil rights, and in Canada, we don't have amendments the way they do in the United States. We do have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but we have freedom of information, the press, expression, religion, all of these rights. Now, here's the problem. And it's not a problem, it's just a reality, because democracy is hard. The reality is, I, in a democracy, should have full rights as long as And this is stipulated in the Constitution, as long as those rights don't infringe upon the rights of other people. Right? But here's where it gets complicated. How much freedom do I get to say and do and be who I want to be, as long as it doesn't impact somebody else? And we try to hold those rights as diverse and as wide as we possibly can, but all of our rights have limitations, every single right. You have freedom of association, absolutely. But in this country, for example, if the organization that you are a part of has been deemed linked to terrorist activity, that is limited. Now, could we argue about who gets to make those decisions? Absolutely. But I think we understand the limitation of that right. We also have freedom of expression. We can say whatever we want to say. Now, by doing so, my rights are protected from the government. So the government can't stop me from talking. The government can't stop me from having that freedom of expression until I promote hate and I incite violence. There's the line. But you see, this all gets murky. This all gets very confusing, because then you have groups, rather than overtly stipulating things, you have them using metaphors, and you have them use different words to mean the same thing. So instead of using words like white supremacy, because we know what those words are how those are connected, we start using words like white pride. We start using words like individual pride. We start using words like historical respect. We just change the vernacular. We change the words. And when we change the words, we don't change their intent. But again, it's given us that freedom. That's why in Canada, as disgusting as seeing somebody wave a swastika flag, it's not illegal. It is in Germany, by the way, because, well, they know where that leads. But it's not illegal. All right? We've given all of this as much as we possibly can. That is not to say, by the way, that Twitter, that Instagram, that TikTok, that YouTube, whatever it is, cannot limit what I say on their platform that has nothing to do with my freedoms. They aren't responsible for protecting my freedoms, and in fact, they're not the ones that can even take it away. They can just change the services I have access to. So all of this really ties into one of the most important parts of democracy, which is when my freedoms infringe on somebody else's safety. I'm driving my car, I'm doing 200 kilometers an hour on the 401, I'm going to get arrested, I'm going to put in jail. Even if I didn't hurt anybody. I can't drive drunk. Why? Well, it's clear. The implications of what I could do, or the foreseeable reality of me causing harm, is enough in a free and democratic society in which I have freedom to limit that freedom, because the foreseeable reality of me hurting somebody else or many other people is significant enough. And we talk about COVID, and we talk about the last 2 years that have been horribly frustrating and exhausting. We're really talking about a balance of that. We're really talking about a balance of life versus liberty. And I honestly believe that if more politicians could have talked and spoken about this honestly and intellectually, rather than politically jockeying for who was going to get votes in the next election, we would have had a much different thing. I don't think the truckers' convoy ever would have happened. Ever. It wouldn't have happened because the language that we use matters and the way we attack things matter. Even though I still believe that mandates save lives and we should have instilled them for the greater level of public safety, it's the way we spoke about them. It's the hypocritical ways we implemented them without conversation, without explanation, without intelligence. And then we take them away when our polling numbers shift. To me, that's the real frustrating mark. And it happens, and if you look across Canada, specifically, and the United States, it happens across all levels of government, all different types of government, all different political parties. And that should be significant. That should have significant weight. When we talk about having a full democracy, we have to consistently balance what is functional, what can we do, versus how much democracy do we get to keep. So, everybody can't do everything they've ever wanted to do, and they can't vote on every particular issue that ever comes before government. Okay, that's too much. But how much balance do we have? How do we allocate certain powers to government so that they have the power to do these things? We limit some of our freedoms in order to mitigate the damage done to democracy or to other people. How do we balance all of that? Because if a democracy can't function, it's not useful either. It's not going to have anything done. Canada right now, 338 members of House of Commons. Each member represents about 200,000 people. When people talk about representation by population, that's one, guys, I could barely get my class of 20 kids to agree on something. So it's not about consensus. But even trying to represent 200,000 people seems really, really difficult and sometimes kind of anti-democratic. But in the States, it's worse. One member of the House of Representatives represents about 800,000 Americans. That's how the representation there works. That doesn't seem as democratic. But here's the balance. What if we increased it? What if instead of having 338, I double it? I double it so that each MP now represents about 75,000 Canadians. Does it become more democratic? Perhaps. But does that amount of government start to become economically, problematic? And do decisions get made at a slower speed? Are they any better decisions? Do they become any more efficient at running a democracy? Or does the constant battle for power, get in the way of any decision getting made, which happens in the United States all the time? All the time. That's what happens when you elect a president separate from your legislative body. The legislative body's Republican, tells the Democratic president to, get lost. We're never passing anything you want. Or the Democratic or the Republican body here passes something and the opposite to them, the president strikes it down. And so you're stuck at this deadlock. And now, even though you have people representing your interests, nothing happens. And I'm going to end on this very last point because I think this is the bottom line of a democracy that I think we need to fix. And this is the problem. We have politicians that we elect, no matter who you believe, no matter who you vote for, that promise 10 things for their election. And you go to the polling stations or you go to the electoral booths and you say, okay, this candidate promises these 10, this candidate these 10, and so on. I am going to make a determination on their promises. You elect them. And then COVID happens. And I'm using COVID as an example because life is like this, right? There's a war, there's an environmental crisis, there's a health crisis. So many different things can happen. And that politician that you elected on the premise of those 10 things can no longer do them. Is that a failure of the politician or the reality of the practical times that they face? I'll go you one step further. Let's say that you elect somebody on the basis of their 10 promises and they get elected. Once they're elected, and in that 5-year term, they only decide to fulfill 2. What was the point of my democracy then? Is that democracy? Is it democracy when they only do 2 of the 10 things? Have they fulfilled any democratic sort of principle in that moment, even if they could? And I think a lot of people are disheartened to the point of not voting, not caring, never putting anything in until there's a frustration level during a pandemic of a lack of accountability and a lack of conversation and a lack of ownership and explanation of issues. Do we see people wanting to be involved in politics? And I think democratic accountability has to be the main and the most important thing that we hold on to. But we have to give space for huge life universe-altering events like COVID to allow our government to deal with it as they deem fit. And then that's why we end up basing it in some sort of ideological principle, not practical one. Not what are you going to promise me, but what's your character? What things do you hold the most dear? Because if I don't know the character of your party, I have no idea of how you're going to respond to the next crisis. And how you respond to the next crisis is probably more important than your list of 10 things. All right, guys, I hope that some of that made sense to you, that struck chords with you. If you have any questions, please throw them in the comments below. And next week, we are going to address the trucker convoy and all of the intricacies and the different perspectives as we relate it to that convoy, not just my own. Thanks so much for hanging out, guys. We will see you next Tuesday. Same bat time, same bat channel. Dismissed.